Boomer on a Friday, everyone. Appreciate everyone being here at the Voice of College Football, talking Oklahoma football. We got Parker Thune on the line. It's KREF Sports, of course, every Monday through Friday, noon to 3 Central. Catch him on OU Rivals platform as well. Oklahoma's got a date against West Virginia. They're a 13-point favorite. The over-under, if you're into those things, 58 last I checked. Parker, how you doing today?
Doing fantastic, Mark. Always a pleasure.
We made mention of this before we started to record, Parker. 7-2, a heck of a lot better than 6-7. And this team, there is no question, this is vast improvement over what we saw in 2022. But when you arrive at this place after 7 consecutive wins, beat Texas, and there starts the college football playoff talk, then the fan base doesn't like to see the 2 losses following that, all that hype and all that buildup. But really at 7-2, kind of that top 15 to 20 team, is this really more what this team is?
Yeah, it is, Mark. And I think this is commensurate with preseason expectations in my eyes and in the eyes of many in this sphere. You rewind to August, most everyone credible was saying, okay, this team is probably in the 9-3, 10-2 range, top 20, but maybe not top 15. And that is, especially coming off 6-7, a pretty solid building block and launch pad into a future in the SEC. But obviously, a lot of fans are miffed with the back-to-back losses to Kansas and Oklahoma State. As I see it, Mark, this is not your daddy's Kansas Jayhawks, right? This is a incredibly improved Kansas team from where they were 5 years ago or 2 years ago, or even 1 year ago for that matter. And Oklahoma State, man, the turnaround that they have orchestrated this season after that non-conference loss to South Alabama, where many, including myself, just stuck a fork in them right off the bat, man, it's impressive. And so there's no shame in losing those 2 football games, 2 games that came down to the final possession against top 20 opponents. I think, yeah, it is pretty indicative on the large scale. This team's resume right now is indicative of what they are, which is a top 20 team, probably overperformed a little bit to start the season. The win against Texas was impressive, and it was a statement, but they were going to come back down to earth at some point. It was just a matter of how spectacular the crash was going to be, and I believe many fans didn't expect that it would come in the form of back-to-back losses, which is something that is inherently uncommon to the Oklahoma experience. Obviously, they had back-to-back losses on 2 separate occasions in the 6-7 campaign, but prior to that, they lost back-to-back games in 2020. Those were the only 2 games they lost all year. They lost back-to-back games in 2016. Those were the only 2 games that they lost all year that season either. So at least in recent memory, these fans and this program, they're not used to a losing skid, as it were. And so that has affected the perception greatly.
And while year 2 was supposed to be better, and much of that had to do with the transfer portal additions and the recruiting class and actual football on the field, when most people talked about, okay, the expectations being 9-3, 10-2, the first reason was schedule. Look at the schedule. So there is that, and maybe some of these teams, like in Oklahoma State, of course, as you well note, better than expected. When we look at the running back situation, this has intrigued me going back to the end of last season, because Devontae Barnes and Gavin Sawchuk were billed as 1-2. And of course, we saw that most notably in the bowl game against Florida State. Then we come through the offseason in which Devontae Barnes was the guy that was more prominent last season. Gavin Sawchuk, of course, has this big game against Oklahoma State, 13 carries for 111. Devontae Barnes with 1 carry. Is that still just viewed as an injury situation? Whoever's healthier is getting the playing time?
Yeah, Barnes hadn't been 100% all year. And the Sooners have kind of fiddled with inserting him into the game plan to varying extents all year. The only game in which he has dominated the share of the workload, to my recollection, would have been the Tulsa game back in mid-September. I mean, after that Tulsa game, which was the 3rd game of the year, as I recall, he did not see a carry again until the Kansas game. So went over a month, went 6 weeks without touching the field. And so his injury situation, I'll use the word that Brent Venables used to describe it. It's funky right now. And he very obviously has not been 100% even when he has been active. The guy that's been a revelation for Oklahoma out of the backfield is walk-on running back Tawi Walker, who is an absolute bowling ball of a human being, 5'9" in the 220-pound range, just sheer muscle. And he is not very fast. If you had to, if he ran a 40-yard dash, probably not running it any faster than 4.8. But he never goes down upon first contact, is one of the absolute toughest running backs I've seen at the collegiate level, period, to bring down, and runs so low to the ground that he's capable of bowling over or bouncing off pretty much any tackler that he comes upon in the open field. It often takes a gaggle to bring him down. And so he was not expected preseason to have much of a role in this backfield, but he has drastically exceeded those expectations and really emerged as the number one back in the committee for Oklahoma. Sawchuk's emergence over the last couple of weeks has been an encouraging sight. He had a 64-yard touchdown run against Oklahoma State last week. So that's a guy that himself was dealing with some injury issues at the beginning of the season, but has progressively seen his snap count increase, and he could be on the verge of much greater things.
It's, in a sense, Parker, you know this better than I do, dealing with the recruiting aspect of this. It's a dynamic that is somewhat unique to college football, that this is the 5-star, this is the guy that's supposed to be better, and it takes a long time for some of the fan base to get over well, this guy, regardless of where he was recruited, where he was ranked, has proven to be a really good player. Maybe the measurables aren't there in terms of, the 40 or the other, tangibles, but he just flat out's a baller. He's a gamer. He can play football.
Yeah, and that's certainly what Tawi Walker is. And Oklahoma, is one of those programs that has been blessed by the presence of several guys like that over the years. I think their top target in the passing game this year, outside of Nick Anderson, has been a guy that's very much cut from that same cloth in Drake Stoops, Bob's son, right? Who's already got a career high 52 receptions on the year. He had 12 for 134 and a touchdown against Oklahoma State. Again, a guy that came to Oklahoma as a walk-on. He's now a sixth-year senior, has never taken anything for granted, and just has continually grinded throughout the season and the offseason to get better and better and better and earn a larger role with this football team. And you think about Oklahoma's identity historically, Mark, those are the types of players that they won championships with. And naturally, the game has changed. The college football of today is not the college football of 25 years ago. You can't really have a championship foundation built upon those types of guys anymore. You got to have some studs. You got to have some 4- and 5-star dudes. But Oklahoma and Nebraska, I would throw into that conversation as well. When you think about schools in the Midwest, I know Oklahoma technically isn't the Midwest, but for all intents and purposes, we're talking about the same region. Those programs, when you think of their championship teams of old, they had that identity. Man, maybe it wasn't necessarily the most impressive athletes. Maybe there were guys that came in as walk-ons, intent upon earning their way, but they did that, and they contributed to the hard-nosed, knock down, drag it out, grind it out style of football that those teams won titles with.
It's funny you went that direction, Parker, because I was going to ask you next about Drake Stoops. Of course, not just because of the remarkable game that he had, 12 for 134 on Saturday, but yeah, just being one of those guys that I'm guessing that much of the fan base looks at and says, nice player, we appreciate the contribution, but we would like to replace him with somebody who's bigger, stronger, faster, high points the football. But in that slot position that, and I can't recollect, even though I watch most of the games, exactly where they're lining him up. So maybe I'm making an assumption there. The classic example being, of course, Hunter Renfrow at Clemson, that everybody, even with game-winning touchdown passes and national championship games, continued to disregard is okay. Yeah, he's a nice, it's fun. It's nice to watch. It's good for him. But then he goes to the pros and he's catching 100 passes a year. So there's obvious talent there. I'm not going to try to make that comparison. And I don't know how much you dive into the NFL perspectives, but does Drake Stoops have a future?
Well, it's funny you bring up Hunter Renfrow, Mark, because that's exactly the guy to whom I've compared Drake Stoops on many occasions. And I have long said, yes, Drake Stoops is an NFL football player. I expect him to play pro ball one day. And again, you go back to the whole bigger, stronger, faster thing. And that's part of what makes football a beautiful sport, right? Bigger, stronger, faster doesn't always equal better. And Drake Stoops is a better football player than 90% of the guys that might otherwise occupy his position at the University of Oklahoma operating out of that slot role. Man, he is so technically sound, so savvy, and so hard-nosed when he gets the ball in his hands. I certainly view him as a guy that maybe he doesn't get drafted. Maybe he doesn't hear his name called on draft day, but I think that's a guy that will play on Sundays at some point because he's too relentless not to.
We've got Parker Thune here to talk OU football. You all know who he is, but it's a good reminder. KREF Sports every Monday through Friday, 12 to 3 Central Time. OU Insider on Rivals as well. Parker, we started to hit on the injury situation at the running back position. Any other concerns across either side of the football?
Well, off the top of my head, obviously Oklahoma lost the guy that at that point was their top receiver on the year in Andrell Anthony. You go back to the Texas game. That's when he suffered the injury that's going to cost him the remainder of the season. Defensively, they've had some guys banged up. They haven't had anybody sidelined long-term other than their starting cheetah, Justin Harrington, who 2 games into the year suffered a partially torn ACL that effectively took him out of action. He's going to apply for a waiver, try to come back for a 7th year next season at Oklahoma. So they're looking forward to having him back. But Peyton Bowen has dealt with some ankle issues. Gentry Williams, the cornerback, has had a variety of ailments that have hampered him over the last couple of weeks. Danny Stutzman should return this Saturday after missing the Oklahoma State game. And I mean, you got a few guys here and there. R. Mason Thomas, for instance, his status has been kind of up in the air week to week, just kind of depending on how he's feeling, how he's progressing. But all in all, this is, I would say, relative to most teams in college football, a pretty healthy group right now, other than the typical week-to-week bumps and bruises.
This, of course, is going to be a last look at West Virginia, like it is with just about everyone else in the Big 12, barring, postseason appearances and scheduled non-conference games. But it's been a series dominated by the Sooners. I believe they lost last year in a field goal game, but otherwise have dominated the series. Some interesting games, though. I think of the Will Grier West Virginia team that, played the zany, practically 60-point game, like 58-56, that would have moved West Virginia into the Big 12 championship game. Somebody had a strip sack turnover that was huge in that one for OU, correct?
And Caleb Kelly.
Okay. And then Spencer Rattler's team that survived on a last-second field goal at home a few years ago. That might have been the COVID year.
No, so they didn't play in the COVID year. That game was
next year.
canceled. It was 2021,
Yeah.
Lincoln Riley's final year and Spencer Rattler's final year at Oklahoma. That was a 16-13 football game, one of the dullest I can recall watching.
Yes, Oklahoma doesn't play many of those games. You'd have to move to, the Big Ten Western Division to get used to those games. So this is no joke of a game, even though Oklahoma is the 13-point favorite. We know what the point spread was against UCF a couple weeks ago, of course, at home. And this West Virginia team is playing for Neil Brown's job, and they've done a pretty good job of it at 6-3, 4-2 with the same record in conference. I got to think that their game plan is a lot of C.J. Donaldson trying to man up with an offensive line that's considered one of the best in the conference against OU defensive line that is good, but in terms of rush defense has shown some vulnerability.
Yeah, and I think the recipe, as it has been the last 2 years for this West Virginia group under Neil Brown, is going to be to muck it up, right? Make the game messy, slow it down, or I guess speed it up, depending on how you're looking at it. But just make this make this anything but a track meet, because you're not going to win a track meet, not with that cast of characters up in Morgantown against these Oklahoma Sooners. And so you look at 2021, that was how West Virginia was able to hang with Oklahoma throughout the football game, is they managed to slow the game down, control the tempo, keep Oklahoma's offense in check and keep them from finishing drives with touchdowns. And then in 2022, it was much the same up in West Virginia. It was a real slow, real defensively oriented football game, not a ton of scoring. 23-20 was the final in West Virginia. After Oklahoma beat them the year before on a chip shot field goal at the buzzer, they returned the favor in the exact same fashion. So that's got to be the roadmap, if you will, for West Virginia to beat Oklahoma. The Sooners have to start fast, I think, Mark, and that is one thing that they have continually this year shown. I don't know if you would call it an inability to do that, but it hasn't been something that they've done with regularity. And it was something that they needed to accomplish last weekend against Oklahoma State, because you get that team in a hole, they're not engineered to play from behind, right? So that was something that would have greatly increased their chances of winning that full game against the Cowboys. Didn't happen. Now you come into a game with a West Virginia team that has been able to execute their game plan and has been able to cook up their recipe to victory each of the last 2 seasons, even though only one of those games actually resulted in a win. West Virginia had every opportunity to win in 2021. You can argue they should have won that game in Norman. So is it going to be more of the same, or are you going to be able to put those trends to rest, kind of put your foot in the ground and emphasize for your fans and for the college football world as a whole that what's happened the last 2 weeks against Oklahoma State and Kansas is not the start of a new trend for this football team as they stumble towards the finish line?
Parker, with the playoff off the table, anyone who really sizes up the program, there is so much to take in for any college football program to properly evaluate the progress. But to the majority, is it simply going to be, we made the Big 12 championship game, successful season. We did not make the Big 12 championship game, not successful.
Well, I think everybody has their own definitions of success, Mark, and that fans by nature look at things differently. There are certain fans that insist those 2 losses the past 2 weeks are unacceptable. It's Oklahoma State and Kansas. That's how fans see it. Oklahoma State, we've dominated that series. Kansas, haven't lost to them since 1997. Unacceptable, those losses. But I think the people who have their heads square on their shoulders understand that where Oklahoma is right now is pretty congruent with what the preseason expectations were. They've still got the opportunity to finish with double-digit wins in the regular season. And do they need a thing or two to break their way down the stretch? Sure, but there's still a path for them to play in the Big 12 championship game. I think most anybody that's looking at this from a holistic perspective and has an understanding that what Oklahoma is having to do here under Brent Venables is thoroughly rebuild the program from the ground up, they're more than pleased with what Oklahoma has accomplished through 9 games here in 2023. And unless the wheels just fall off here over the next 3 games, I think whatever Oklahoma's record at the end of the regular season might be, 9-3, 10-2, again, that's going to be viewed in general as a successful year 2 under Brent Venables, all things considered.
There's a log jam at the top of the Big 12 that was super muddled a week ago, but there's a lot of clarity given that Oklahoma State won this game. They're sitting at 5-1. So it's simply, they've got to lose twice and Oklahoma's got to win out. And then there are other factors with Kansas at 4-2. They've got the tiebreaker against OU. It's a pretty thin path, I got to think.
Well, and I think, honestly, if you're an Oklahoma fan right now, you're kind of conceding in your head, if you're drawing out the scenarios in which Oklahoma makes a Big 12 championship game, you're almost conceding one spot to Oklahoma State because odds are they're not going to lose twice in the next 3 weeks. I mean, that is highly unlikely. What might be more likely is Texas gets upset. And if Texas loses and has 2 conference losses, then you own the tiebreaker over them in the head-to-head. And so you're half a step ahead of them, if you will, and you're then in line to have a rematch with Oklahoma State down in Arlington. But the other prerequisite is Kansas has to lose. So the path is pretty straightforward for Oklahoma. It's not an incredibly likely path, but as long as Texas stumbles somewhere along the way, and as long as Kansas stumbles somewhere along the way, I don't know that it is entirely that simple because there are a whole bunch of tiebreaker scenarios that always come into play and make things more nuanced than they look at face value. But if you're an Oklahoma fan, you don't really care what happens with Oklahoma State the rest of the way. You're focused on Texas, you're focused on Kansas, and hoping that both of those programs slip up down the stretch.
I wasn't thinking that through. Duh. They've got the tiebreaker on Texas. They're the team that I think everyone already just has automatically slotted into the Big 12 championship game, and that everyone else is inferior. But yes, the head-to-head. And therefore, Kansas State's not necessarily the favorite team of Oklahoma right now after what they messed up in overtime last week. They could have really made it for a fun situation.
Yeah, no doubt. That was that was a game. Well, at that point, though, that kicked off at 11 a.m. Bedlam kicked off at 2:30 p.m. At that point, you didn't really care whether Kansas State or Texas won that game. OU fans were just kind of focused. Their one-track mind was focused on winning Bedlam. And obviously, now that didn't happen, you look back on it and say, okay, well, probably would have been better if Kansas State had won that game for OU's sake. But even so, Kansas State wins that game. They're right there at the top of the conference with only 1 conference loss right now. So it was almost as if that was an elimination game between Kansas State and Texas for a Big 12 championship berth, or at least a shot at a Big 12 championship berth. Now, I mean, the chips have fallen just so, and you got to root for a Kansas loss. You got to root for a Texas loss if you're an Oklahoma fan.
And Parker, for those folks that are strictly championship or bust, I'm sure the message boards are already crammed full of SEC type talk. You know, what are we going to do in the SEC? What's it going to look like in the SEC? Which I wouldn't even touch at this point because the offseason is so long. It's the longest in sports for college football fans that we can get to it there, except we do have a national signing day in what, 5 weeks? Less than 5 weeks away from the early signing period. So your thoughts about Oklahoma's class, and if not just that ranking looks where it should, but the entirety of the class, positional needs, all of it.
Yeah, it's a great class, Mark, and a very, very balanced class. I mean, there are many in this market who have been covering Oklahoma for much longer than I have that would concur with the assessment that this might be Oklahoma's most balanced class of the 21st century. When you're talking about a truly elite recruiting class, right? It's easy to have balance without top flight talent. Oklahoma has both. They've assembled a wonderful class on the defensive side of the ball. They've assembled a wonderful class on the offensive side of the ball. It currently ranks 6th in the nation in our Rivals.com industry rankings, and they still are eyeing a couple targets here down the stretch. Offensive tackle Grant Bricks, a top 100 player in the nation from the state of Iowa. He's going to be down in Oklahoma for an unofficial visit this weekend, and the Sooners hope to lock him up, add him to the class, and then they'll be hosting a cornerback from the state of Florida by the name of Cameron Campbell on an official visit this weekend. And that would be, get this, Mark, the 8th defensive back in this Oklahoma class if he were to jump on board with the Sooners. So it's a heavy one right now. 27 scholarship commits already. That number could touch or approach 30 by signing day, but this is the new name of the game. It is over-signing, if you will. It is addition by subtraction. You got guys that aren't going to cut it. You sit them down, say, hey, listen, probably best for you to explore options via the portal because we don't have a viable path to the field for you here at Oklahoma. So it's it's a cutthroat world we're living in here in 2023. That is the new norm with the portal and with the way that the game has changed. But that's also part of overhauling a roster, which the Sooners needed to do badly when Venables got to town, because that had become a very one-dimensional football team. And it's not something that you flush out and weed out in the span of a single offseason, right? I would say it's not till 3-4 years into the Venables era that you will have completely overhauled the roster to your exact specifications. And so that process continues this offseason.
There's all sorts of people that are going to roll their eyes as soon as I bring up this name, but I'm going to do it anyway because there still is a connection and fascination. And
Sure.
I rarely do it, but I'm going to do it here because we've got a USC channel, a USC show. And so Brent Venables has brought up all sort, and for much of the season, it was, well, USC so much better than Oklahoma. I'm talking about the rhetoric on the other channel, USC so much better than Oklahoma. And then suddenly within 2 weeks, it's, look at what Brent Venables is doing. This is horrible. How this is unacceptable. So just in terms of OU fans keeping their eyes on Lincoln Riley, USC, of course, they're moving conferences as well, but having all sorts of issues on the defensive side. And, old friend Alex Grinch is now unemployed.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's it's very interesting how the narrative has flipped, hadn't it? Even nationally, between the whole USC Oklahoma divorce, the Riley Oklahoma divorce, if you will, and the move to USC. And of course, those two programs, as long as Riley are there, are going to be stacked up and compared. But I think it boils down to philosophy, right? Riley got to USC and he was looking for microwave results, which he got, to be fair, in year one. Brent Venables got to Oklahoma and said, okay, we're going to use the crock pot with this thing. It might not happen right off the bat, but we're going to have this program continually building towards championship contention with the goal of being there when we arrive in the SEC. And here's the thing, Mark. 2024, as we look ahead to next season, yes, Oklahoma is going to make the transition to the SEC, but there's another huge change happening in college football, and that is the expansion of the playoff to 12 teams. And with the SEC being quite clearly the most loaded league in America, especially after OU and Texas arrive, you might not have to finish top 3 in the SEC in order to sneak into the college football playoff. So championship contention in the SEC, that standard, that designation affords you a lot more room for error than the Big 12 in the era of the 4-team playoff. So I think Brent Venables approached this job at Oklahoma with the understanding that, okay, first couple years I'm here, we're probably not going to be playing for a berth in the college football playoff, and that's fine. But when we get to the SEC, especially given the added margin for error that we will have as an upper echelon program in the best conference in America, we're going to be able to cope with 2, 3, maybe even 4 losses over the course of a season and not have it derail our mission and still be playing meaningful football with a chance to work our way towards a national championship once December and January rolls around and you get that expanded playoff field. So yeah, again, it's a tale of two different philosophies. And Riley wanted to win immediately at USC. Again, he did. But much like Sonny Dykes and TCU, what's the nature of a microwave, Mark? 1 second, it's to 350 degrees heating your food. The next, you open up the door and it's room temperature, completely cool. And it's been that way for TCU this year in 2023 as they've come back to earth. The same is true for USC. And admittedly, Oklahoma fans are less than thrilled with the 2-game skid. But if you look at this from the big picture perspective, what you have seen with this Oklahoma program in year 2 is market improvements over year 1. And if Venables' philosophy, if his vision, if his culture continues to take root at Oklahoma, and there's no reason to think it won't or hasn't, then year 3 should bring even greater success for this program.
Something you brought up about wins and losses in the SEC as it pertains to a college football playoff berth. And there could be a great argument about the 4 additions from the Pac-12 improving the Big Ten and how you measure that out versus the SEC. But we will see it on the field. Yeah, 10-2 history will show you if you run all the models of what it would have looked like for all these years. 10-2, you're safe in pretty much any conference. 9-3, that's where you need that SEC lean because you're about 15th in the country between 10 and 15. And yeah, it's going to be fascinating because there has been given preference to the SEC, but they have earned it based on past results, certainly. So, how much of that reputation moves into the new format and versus just actual, of course, results on the field in non-conference play is going to be very interesting.
Yeah, no doubt. And I think when you look at the landscape of college football in 2023, there actually doesn't seem to be that wide of a gap between the SEC and the rest of the nation. At least not as wide as there has been in the past, right? Georgia is very clearly one of the top teams in the country. Alabama, they had to kind of shake off some early season doldrums, but they're right there as well. Beyond Georgia and Alabama, I mean, you kind of have a drop off where you don't really view anybody else in the conference right now as a true championship contender. Ole Miss has had a nice run. Their playoff contention probably comes to an end this weekend in Athens. But all in all, that is the nature of the beast in the SEC because you're gonna get programs that beat themselves up every single week, and you truly have to be on another level to win 11, 12 games perennially in that league. Tennessee, LSU, Ole Miss, you look at any of those teams in the second tier of the SEC, you could make the argument they'd run just about any other conference in America, but especially because you're dealing with a 4-team playoff these days, they're never going to sniff that field because it's virtually impossible, again, unless you have recruited and developed and are coached on the same plane as Georgia and Alabama to be able to get through the grind of that SEC schedule and have maintained a level of play that allows you to vault into the top 4 at season's end. So life's going to get a lot easier for the SEC and all of the teams therein, I think, once the 12-team playoff arrives, because 2 losses isn't going to tank your season the way it has in the past.
Absolutely. Parker Thune, KREF Sports, OU Insider on Rivals. Any particular work, anything that you've got available that people need to know about?
Yeah, OUinsider.com is the place to be if you're a Sooner fan and you want all the best insight, behind the scenes insight at that on OU football and recruiting. So get over there if you haven't already. Appreciate you as always, Mark. This is always a ton of fun to do.
Thanks, Parker. We appreciate it. Thank you so much. Enjoy the game.
Yes, sir. You as well.
Parker Thune, again, KREF Sports, OUinsider.com on Rivals. You see the obvious knowledge, insight, and everything else. I'm guessing just about all of you are familiar. Wanted to clean up a few things here at the Voice of College Football. You are most likely watching us on SC1 Sports Oklahoma channel. So keep your subscription right here. Keep it locked in with everything that they've got going at SC1 Sports. They do a great job. Simulated games are a feature there, and everything at SG1 Sports. Also want to let you know that we've launched a Big 12 channel. And you're probably saying, Mark, we're not going to be in the Big 12 for long. I know it's only 3 more regular season games, but we've got a Big 12 channel that we simulcast this Oklahoma show on. So please subscribe to the Voice of College Football Big 12. But we've also launched at the beginning of the season an SEC channel. So once that transition takes place, and I'm not talking about after the spring sports season, we are football based here. So after the postseason, immediately we're going to start to move all of our Oklahoma content over to the SEC channel. So please subscribe to the Oklahoma, to get Oklahoma content, subscribe to the SEC channel here at the Voice of College Football. I let everyone know during a brief version of OU Sooners Live on Thursday that we've got a few changes going on. Jason Ray's not able to join us quite as often, a lot of work obligations and responsibilities for him. And we appreciate Jason, because otherwise that number that you see in the banner, 137, that's the number of shows we've delivered here for OU Sooners Live. So that's almost 3 full seasons every week. But we would like to continue. We intend on continuing with the help of guys like Parker Thune, John Hoover, John Williams, a number of guests that we've brought on in recent months covering Oklahoma football. So we're going to be here. Our intent is at least once a week with a Sooners Live show, if not more. So keep it locked in here at the Voice of College Football. Get to the Big 12 channel, get to the SEC channel. Please check them out, subscribe. You're going to see a lot of great content there as well. Let me know if there's anyone you would like to see on our broadcast here covering Oklahoma football. Let me know that as well. Enjoy the game against West Virginia. OU a 13-point favorite, over under at 58, trying to move the record to 8-2 and hope for the best elsewhere in the conference to get back to the Big 12 championship game. We appreciate your help and support. You can support at Venmo, PayPal, and Cash App. Just search Mark Rogers TV. Thank you so much, and we will see you soon over on the main channel. Keep in mind, the Jim Harbaugh saga continues. Who knows? Maybe he's suspended by now. I've not checked the news for the last 30 minutes, but a suspension may be imminent. I personally don't believe that's going to happen, but I've been wrong in the past. So we will be on Jim Harbaugh suspension watch on the main channel, and we'll go live if that happens. Otherwise, we've got a late night call-in show. So please join us on the main channel, folks. If you're not aware, we've got a main channel. We do call-in shows all week. Talk college football with us here at the Voice of College Football. Have a great football weekend.